As Kathleen is reminding everybody, fill out the spreadsheet with your AIA number so that you automatically get credit. You could always self-report if you fail to do that. Welcome to folks who just joined. We're going to give it one more minute and then we're going to get started. All right, I'm going to get going and more people may show up, and that's a bummer. They'll miss my intro. Welcome to what I believe is going to be our last Committee on the Environment program of the year. We've got Klaus presenting on some of his work from the Maryland Climate Change Committee and the Building Subgroup on carbon and the built environment, operational and embodied carbon. I'm really looking forward to hearing this. I think probably everyone on the call knows Klaus and his work. He is truly a local legend. Let's see, fellow of the AIA, president of ArcPlan. I first ran into his work back on the red line pretty much straight on when I moved to town. He's been doing deep systems thinking for longer than my whole career and then a good bit. Klaus, take it away, and thank you again for this presentation.
Yeah, good morning. Congratulations on starting your day with decarbonizing the built environment. It's the topic that's always on your mind right after breakfast, I'm sure. Obviously we are motivated with the Glasgow conference and this being in the news every day. And so if the code committee doesn't have their mind always on this, they sure do now. As Ben said, this presentation is a modification of what I presented to the Maryland Climate Commission, which was a fairly ballsy thing that I took the invitation from them to present to them, because that's a really high caliber group of experts, and I'm not. And so anyway, you will see what I told them. And as you know, that the discussion about sustainable built environment has or is slightly moving from just a focus on energy to a broader lens about the carbon footprint. And this shift in focus is what I try to also tell the Commission about. So we are now talking also embodied carbon in materials, all the way from production to recycling of the building at the end of life. We talk about non-fossil fuels in the context of, energy efficiency is not so much an issue anymore if you had really renewable fuels. And land use and site design, which are always two aspects that are dear to my heart, but they are not necessarily on everybody's radar when we are talking about sustainability. So the learning objectives are these. I don't need to read them out, but we will talk about operational and embodied carbon and that distinction that I just mentioned already. And myself, I am not a expert or specialist in sustainability. necessarily, but I have always made sustainability the center of my activities. So this more holistic sustainability perspective in the 46 years, and Ben alluded to the long duration of my practice, 46 years intersecting buildings, urban design, and planning. And that has also led me to a lot of work in the nonprofit sector and in civic engagement. And so in the holistic view of sustainability, all these things intersect. And I always thought that the best building isn't worth much if it isn't responsive to the context. And in sustainability, we talk more and more about systems, and buildings are part of systems. And applied to decarbonization, this means the greenest building doesn't count much if it was created by ransacking the land around it, or if it doesn't have equitable access, or was created with a huge carbon footprint in the construction, or it is so expensive that it can't scale. That would be sort of like an all-electric Porsche, or this morning in the paper, there is Biden in an all-electric Hummer that has 650 horsepower and a sticker price of $160,000. Its contribution to carbon reduction wouldn't be good because it was too much energy spent to build, too much embodied carbon in it, and too expensive to scale. So this is the holistic view that I have, is to look at things in the long view. And that is, Ben is just starting with fatherhood, and I have already 9 grandchildren. So I just looked at that the other day. The youngest grandchild will be my age in 2085. So that is the time horizon we have to think about at the very least. And that's not, all that long, but it's almost impossible to do. So as I said, the COP conference put this all into perspective again last week, or the last 2 weeks, and those of you who followed it could see that the urgency is beyond doubt, but the implementation and the activities, that is the rub. Let's just, I'd like to talk about community. My blogs are called Community Architects. So there was a calculation done by the ICLEI to calculate what regional local governments would have to do to make their communities so carbon reduced that they would meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius target. And by 2030, which is in 9 years, the average community globally needs to reduce emissions by 63%. So on the community level, so that's the all-encompassing part of buildings, sites, and land use. And as you all know, buildings are responsible for 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. They are also 14% of water consumption. And as I read it, 60% of the global waste. That is just a stunning number. All right. As I said, rating systems are coming along in the same trajectory to kind of moving a little bit from a simple focus just on energy to a broader focus on including carbon, and also including sites and land use. So the buzzwords are complete life cycle and operational energy and embodied carbon. So these are all aspects that in the various rating systems become more and more relevant. And architects have to work with rating systems and certification. Then as Peter Du likes to say, if you play a game without a referee, then you don't have the same game as if there's a referee on the field. And so certification is certainly a good thing. Also, like these rating systems tend to make you think in these checklists and checkboxes, and I'm not a big fan of thinking that way. I like to look this more holistically, but obviously it has to be so that the owners play along, and certification is a good way to do that. So total carbon footprint of buildings. This is a graphic that shows the entire life cycle of buildings. And so it is a lot more than the building itself. And it is a lot more than just the energy consumption in the building. So again, this is the distinction between operational carbon, which is the use of the energy in the building during operation, and embodied carbon, which represents everything that went into making the building. Today, the emphasis is this on that is what I told the Energy Commission, because they had not really done that to date, and their policy recommendations to the state and the legislative period next year are all about operational carbon. So I thought it would be good to speak about embodied carbon as well, because then that needs to be also a policy in the state of Maryland. And so once again, in operation, energy and carbon is kind of a proxy, as long as energy is not renewable. But once you would have all renewable energy, you could kind of relinquish a little bit on the frugality on energy, because then it wouldn't matter as much. If everything is solar, then it wouldn't matter as much whether you're that frugal with the energy. But the thing is that we have had energy savings in the buildings since we started. The first oil crisis is a pivotal point in my life in the 70s. So we have been talking about making things more energy efficient ever since. But we have decreased energy per square meter in the built environment by 25%. But at the same time, we have increased in the last 20 years, and I'm talking about 20 years as the 25% goes for 20 years, and we have increased the global footprint of buildings by 65%. So we are always undoing the energy efficiencies that we gain with more stuff, and that is an ongoing conundrum. And so the carbon problem cannot be solved through energy reduction alone. And it is also it's imperative that we produce clean energy, but we also need to look at the carbon balance of the building, hence the title of this talk. So you probably know this already. The current graphs show that 40% that we make up consists of 28% operations and 11% is materials and construction. And then, of course, materials and construction also move into transportation, because that stuff has to come to the job site, and there is always a question of where it's calculated. But no, what is going on? Get this moving again. The relationship between operations and embodied carbon starts to shift if you put into perspective how much gets built. And so there is an estimate that in the 30 years that are coming up, in the next 30 years, that the footprint of all buildings in the world will be doubled. That is just a staggering thing. And so the more that accelerates, that we build so much, it's not necessarily all in the United States, it's in China and India, wherever, then you get a completely different relationship between embodied carbon and operational carbon. And you see that then the embodied carbon relationship could be almost equal to that of operational carbon. There are, of course, a lot of variables in that. One of them is how energy efficient the buildings themselves are. And then one can look at look at the various graphs in a lot of ways. So here it's about the embodied carbon on the right shows the chief culprits in terms of materials. So three materials, concrete, steel, and aluminum, cause 23% of the carbon emissions. That's that red segment there in the pie chart. And the left chart is just looking at it yet in another way and says the building components that, so the right one is about materials and the left one about building components. So core and shell make about 11% of that CO2, and then industry and making the other stuff is 32%. So then the buzzword is the life cycle assessment, LCA, which goes from the material extraction all the way to the use and the construction, the use, and then the end of life when things get demolished again or in other ways reused, hopefully. So architects, of course, control only a portion of these steps, namely which materials they select. But also sometimes some of us get involved in land use planning and some of us or many of us in site design. So we'll talk about those two items in the full life cycle assessment that happen before the building gets built. So land use. You know, land is the scarcest resource on earth. And this makes land development one of the fundamental components in effective, sustainable building practice. And site design is usually managed by the owner, developer, or contractor, while land use overall is regulated by the local jurisdiction. So depending on with whom we interact and who our client is, we will either deal with just site design or with land use in a broader sense. But the carbon reduction principles would stand in both cases. And gauging the aggregate carbon effects of land use is not for the faint of heart. And that is tried. So as part of the Paris Climate Accord and earlier agreements, the matter is measured every year. And this is a graph that represents the major components of carbon absorption. So you see there is a middle line there, and above it is the carbon emissions and the fossil fuel and the industry. So that's the bad stuff. And then underneath the zero line is the carbon absorption. And you can see there's the ocean, and there is intact land, and there's the atmosphere. There are the three major pieces that take the carbon up. And we know that carbon in the atmosphere is the critical element that we talk about most because it causes the global warming. But the oceans take a good part of the carbon as well. And this is much less clear what happens there because there is a tipping point where the oceans can't take on any more carbon without that they do something really bad, or they don't even take the carbon on anymore. We don't quite know. And if that happens, that the oceans wouldn't take the carbon on anymore than they currently do, then the atmosphere would get an extra load. And but we're talking about the green portion here, which is the land part. And the land part is gauged every year as what the land absorption effectiveness is. And then, of course, land is also an emitter. So we have this dual function that land is an emitter and a sequester of carbon. And in the natural state, it is sequestering carbon, and in the man-made state, it could be an emitter. And so the cumulative effect of the balance of these is really an emerging science. And just in Glasgow and the forest discussion and trying to see what the forests do and whether the forests reduce or increase and by countries, and the United States actually improved their forest cover, and the numbers for the US were changed in the last minute. So it just shows that this is not so easy to get answers on that. But we know in the US that in spite of widespread smart growth policies, the US is very bad at land use, in the sense that it uses a lot more land for development than, say, Europe. And I would say that land use, or not the living standard, is the major driver for the fact that US carbon footprint is per person on average about twice of the carbon footprint of European countries. And here this a bar graph there on the image on the slide shows the United States global carbon footprint or carbon footprint per capita compared to India is at the very bottom. I don't know whether you can read all those countries, and Germany is kind of in the middle. The United Kingdom is smaller, and Italy is smaller, France is smaller, and Brazil is smaller. So these countries, and many of them have actually a similar living standard as the United States. And I would say that one of the big drivers where the difference resides is land use. And why is that so? Why is sprawl so bad for carbon? It's largely transportation, and we'll get to that again in another graph. So that when you sprawl stuff out further, then you have more transportation needs, you have more infrastructure that you have to maintain, you have increased heat islands, and you have increased operational energy to maintain all that infrastructure. And that's what this big infrastructure bill is about, that maintaining it is a lot harder than building it in the first place. So it's obvious that paving over farms, grasslands, and forests is not good for climate. It's not good for a limited resource as land is. So the discussion about land should be just as focused as the discussion about fossil fuels, and that's a limited resource. Land is also a limited resource. So this is the kind of really technical part of this land use calculation. So in 2006, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change started to look at what they call the land use, the LULUCF, land use and land use change and forestry component of the whole carbon discussion. And so the barrels tell us emissions and removals of CO2, as I said already. And in the guidelines that were created for this, there's a distinction between anthropogenic land that has emissions and the unmanaged lands that are the natural lands. The US, not surprisingly, has a very high share of managed land. So the managed, the absorption rate of land in general is 12.3% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. So that sounds like not like the wildest largest bit, but it's 12.3% that are absorbed by land. And the emissions that come from land are really a small piece. So they are 0.4% of all the greenhouse gas emissions. So land does have this positive balance, but, and that's where the smart growth now comes really in, the sequestration potential of the land has decreased by 10.6% since 1990 because of bad land use, not just in the US, but globally. So this contribution that land can make is on the wrong trajectory right now. And there is no US policy, and this is now where it comes back to the Climate Commission and maybe the Code Committee. There is no US policy in place to abate the situation. And the EU, by comparison, has a binding commitment for each member state to ensure that accounted emissions from land use are entirely compensated by an equivalent accounted removal of CO2 from the atmosphere usually, so that there is a no debit rule, and we don't have that. So this would be a policy that we could easily introduce. Oops. So more closer to our usual world, this is a map that shows the carbon footprint of households in this case in our area. This is a map that exists for the entire United States, and the darker blues are good and the reds are bad, and so the map generally shows, without going into any details here, you can, when you have the PowerPoint after the presentation, it will distribute it. You can click that link and use that map and find out in every county how the color is, but it shows that in cities, the color is actually better. So the cities are blue and the countryside, the sprawl areas are red. So suburbanization undermines the greenhouse gas benefits of urban population density. And so one may wonder why that is, because that sounds counterintuitive to many people that are not really deep in the woods with that. And so here is a graph that shows a little bit of how that works. So the left column is a suburban average house. And then next to it is a suburban greenhouse, which is like with all the LEED and sustainability factors targeted. And then next to that is the urban average house. And then next to that is the urban greenhouse. And then the lowest column on the very right is the urban multifamily green, which means, you know, when you go in a city and you make it multifamily and you put all the green things, then you get the lowest footprint on BTU per year. So, but when you see that each of these columns has two colors, and the orange or the yellow is the household use, and the top, the green, is the transportation use. And so you can see that the biggest difference between the suburban and the urban, which is the first column and the third column, where both have like a household use of 115. So what you're using inside the building isn't very different in the suburb, or is exactly the same as and in the city, but the transportation piece is the huge difference. So that's where land use really directly impacts, even in this case, energy. So the upshot of this is promote density. A possible policy that I would highly recommend is no net loss of open space. That should be a Maryland policy, that we are saying we are not going any further out in the landscape, and really recognize that this is a non-renewable resource, land is. And then include the carbon balance into the sustainability and sustainable community palette. So as you know, the state has TOD and main streets and land and historic preservation and so on as part of a sustainable community tax credit palette. And the carbon balance could be introduced into that palette and would be an additional reason to get tax credits. And we could also make local property tax rates based on carbon footprint, or we could have a carbon footprint component in there. So there are a number of ways on how land use could have direct policy implications, and that would be interesting for you all as the code committee to kind of discuss and see how that could be translated into Maryland legislation. So the goal would be, the last bullet down there is to use this European no debit rule and come up with compensation mitigation. So obviously we'll never get to not having any additional greenfields used, but where that happens, there would have to be a mitigation strategy. So site design is essentially kind of the same discussion, except that it's often really the decision of the architect and the local developer that makes the site decisions and the design team. So that's why having talks about the land use first, even if that is usually a municipal decision, really is useful for understanding site design as well. And LEED has, as you know, included now sustainable sites and LEED neighborhoods. So there are a good number of metrics that one can readily employ and actually get for the accreditation and certification. So the prerequisites, as you know, they have to be done, but when standard developments happen, many of these are blissfully ignored. And then on the right side, the credits that one should aim for are, of course, listed there, and they are important. So hopefully, as it is with LEED altogether, that eventually LEED wouldn't be necessary anymore as an incentive program, and you would have regulations that would require all of these things. So that again is a policy question. So a carbon neutral site design would be a little bit like, especially greenfield development, would be a bit like the stormwater management regulations, where the stormwater has to be managed in the way that you are thinking of your site as a forested site, and the stormwater behavior that it would have as a forested site, it would have to have after the development through various stormwater mitigation strategies. And the same could be done with carbon. And then, of course, mitigation strategies for carbon could include if you have large roof areas, or you have parking lots or so, that you use solar installations to get green energy produced on the site, and that is a carbon mitigation strategy. And then also the heat island effect could be calculated the same way, that the site does not make a negative contribution towards the heat islands, that at the very least it would be neutral. These are all aspects I don't think they are part of the mainstream discussion right now. So this would be a kind of cutting edge discussions to have in the state of Maryland to introduce those kinds of metrics. So lastly, embodied carbon in buildings, which you're probably most familiar with. The structure, the finishes, where is the carbon? We talked about this. So here's heavy timber construction and the larger picture, and the standard concrete production on the inserted other image. So we all know that there are a lot of carbon emissions when you use concrete, And I mentioned that already, that concrete was one of the three materials that was at the top of the list with high carbon emissions. So replacing concrete with either lower emission concrete or with other materials is always sort of the low-hanging fruit when the building type allows that discussion or that substitution. So concrete, steel, or aluminum are are all three the chief culprits in materials. And then we know also that core and shell are the major building components. So we can look endlessly at the differences between various floor materials. If we have not really looked at core and shell properly in the beginning, then it's very hard to make this up with finishes in the end, is what I'm saying. And you are probably all familiar with that line of thinking. But that line of thinking is not an easy one for the architect, because the architect has full control often over what the finishes are and not full control over what the core and shell materials are, because of course there's the structural engineer and there are the mechanical engineers and there are all kinds of other folks in there. And then there is a big cost question. So that is also a matter of looking, future-proofing a building would have to put into consideration a longer view than just the initial cost. And so there's as long as carbon isn't priced, of course, you're not going to score very high by removing carbon from materials. So hopefully we'll really get very soon to carbon pricing, because that would make it much easier for architects to have this discussion with the owners, that there is a return on investment when you substitute high carbon materials with low carbon materials. So these are the 10 steps of what to do. Reuse buildings, you know. So instead of building new ones, this is my favorite, because I was always for historic preservation for many, many other reasons. But it is also usually a carbon prudent solution. So I put this under one here. Better concrete mixes, that's really a specialty item that is to be discussed with the structural engineer. You know, then insulation, aluminum, foam, all that stuff. It's kind of interesting that, you know, when we were also focused on energy itself, like in the 70s, in the first oil crisis, we stuck this polystyrene on all the buildings to create a more energy efficient building, but the polystyrene has actually one of the highest emissions of carbon. So sometimes you have to really look at everything before you find a good solution that really helps the climate. Okay, carbon sequestering materials, you know, there's what the forestry people say is that if you put wood into the building, then the carbon that's embedded in the wood and sequestered there will not really be released, at least as long as the building stands. We use materials that is also way underutilized because of our massive centralization and industrialization and how the supply chain works. But there are all kinds of more boutique-y ways that are proof of concept on how you can reuse material, and it would be always good for architects that are cutting edge to use these more boutique-y solutions kind of to show it can be done, and then ultimately it will scale. So, or I mean, reuse materials directly, or use at least those materials that have recycled content. And structural efficiency, you know, we all have our dealings with structural engineers that do things like they have always done them, with a huge amount of extra safety just for laziness. And so most of us hated in our certification as architects the structural part, but the more we understand ourselves about structures, the more we can actually, so it's really a basic message. We need to understand a good bit about mechanical systems and structural systems to be a good influencer in carbon reduction. And waste, so minimize waste. This is a big goal in lead tables, and it's hard to do. There is waste at every step of the way, and anybody who does job site supervision knows how much waste there is on job sites. So there is a lot to be had there. This is just another picture that shows where the carbon really sits. That is from Tomasetti, a large structural engineer, who did an analysis of 600 buildings over 7 years and tabulated where the carbon is, and the three colors are commercial, education, and residential buildings. And one can see that the structural foundations is the very left block, the middle block is columns, then the second from the right is walls, and then the floors. So the floors are the highest, whether that is whatever the use is. And this shows the ability of materials to emit carbon or to even embody capture carbon or sequester carbon. So the red columns to the right is polystyrene at the top, really bad, steel, bad, gypsum board, pretty bad, cement, bad. So this is, I think, one particular, I'm not sure right now what, it is, no, it is an average of a number of analyzed buildings. It's not just one. I think the inserted image on the right is just one. So on average, and the green bars come from using materials that capture carbon and keep it captured as long as the building stands. So laminated bamboo, mass timber, dimensional lumber, straw. And the right image is a case study of a mid-rise concrete building where there is a lot of carbon savings to be had. That's the aggregate of green when you change the concrete mix, if you do something with the rebar, if you do something with the glazing, you do something with the insulation. And that's a mid-rise concrete building. So this would be different on a different type of building. Oops, what is going on? This is not what I wanted. Get rid of this. Working with two screens, and the mouse is often on the other.
Klaus, we're still seeing that same screen, so you're fine so far.
Yeah, okay, good. So then I'm getting to the end anyway here. So the messages are, the take-home messages are just a repetition of what I said already. Floors, walls, foundations have the largest carbon footprints. Mass timber is in some cases the good alternative. Reuse of old buildings has the lowest footprint. So those are the things that are really important to remember when we are trying to reduce carbon and not just energy. And policies, on the waste reduction require manufacturers to take their products back after life cycle. That's an issue all around. This has been discussed for decades with computers and the Dell company, but it is also important on buildings. It's important on car batteries. The Europeans, again, are much further along with really requiring pharmacies to take the medications back, and the appliance manufacturers to take the appliances back. In our country, they are winding up way too often in the landfill. tax carbon is an important policy. So we know we have this Northeast alliance of states between Maine and Florida to have a carbon. I mean, we have RGGI for power plants, but we need now a carbon tax for transportation, and then we need it for everything else also. So this is a state by state, but also a national issue. And that was also a big topic in Glasgow. And the incentives that I mentioned already for use of low carbon products, so that could be state incentives. And public projects, so I mean, the state has for a while said our building should be LEED Silver equivalent, but they're not very strict in enforcing that. But they have not had yet any standards for low carbon standards, so they should do that. And then requiring deconstruction for all building demolitions, at least, you know, initially for the ones that the state controls, and then eventually through the building code in all local jurisdictions. So these are suggestions, because you're the code committee, and these were suggestions also to the Maryland Climate Commission when I talked to them, that next year when they're hopefully looking at the built environment and the embodied carbon, you know, then they want to know at the end, okay, it's all nice and well, we are not scientists necessarily, we want to make policies. So then they put the next year's package of policy suggestions together that, you know, the Maryland Climate Commission has a lot of subcommittees. Each one makes their recommendations, and this could be part of a package that comes out of that building subcommittee. And then here at the end is a bunch of tools that you can use yourself. The embodied carbon tools, the AIA is very good in having help with that, with the material palette, and there are softwares, and there are all kinds of sources where you in your daily practice can look at what are the high and low carbon materials, and you can tally them when you have the right plugin in your software, in your BIM software. Then you can basically at every step, at every decision, tally how much carbon you have in your building. So and with that, the time is up, and it's open for questions.
So Klaus, I've got a couple, and then folks, if you want to put them in the chat, great. If you want to unmute yourself, raise your hand. By all means, you can ask them verbally as well. So the obvious elephant in the room is with the Maryland Climate Change Commission and the building subgroup. How do you suggest we, as industry partners and not particularly represented on that group, how we as design professionals get involved?
Yeah, good question. The whole Climate Change Commission is heavily supported by the various departments in the state, so particularly Department of the Environment. And when this discussion came up that I could speak to them, and I looked at their building subcommittee, ad hoc subcommittee, and I saw no architect on it, I said, well, I will say yes, that I will speak to them, even though it was a bit courageous to do that. And so I did it just to have them open their minds. Okay, there are architects out there, there is an AIA out there, there is a code committee out there. And I think they realized that, and there was this was facilitated by the Baltimore Rotterdam partner city committee, and they the discussion with the Climate Change Commission came about because Holland has good strategies in various fields about resilience and climate change adaptation strategies, and so that's why that sister city committee was in it, and then the sister committee kind of enabled me to speak there. That's how this came about. So the committee meets publicly, and at the end of the year in September or so, they make their policy recommendations. So during the year, their meetings are usually structured so that they have 1 or 2 presentations in the meeting to learn about issues. And they're all on the website and they're all publicly available. So I looked through what they had done on building efficiency and energy, and they had presentations from BGE on how their energy production portfolio looks. And these things are more honest than what you find on the public websites of the various, when you go to BGE and you get their public relations stuff, that's not as accurate as what you find on this MCC website, subcommittee built environment. So I could see that they had a fairly solid basis of information, because when they invite and ask for these presentations, they get good information, was my impression. And so AIA Code Committee could apply formally to the chair of this committee to have a seat on this. And you can also apply to have additional presentations. And then towards the second half of the year, once they have gathered all the information and had the information, then they want to distill this into policies. And that again is then the step where the rubber meets the road. And so you should try to be a part of all of that. And I think they would be open to this, because I started that discussion with them that architects should be a part of it. And they said, yeah, definitely.
Awesome, thank you. Peter, do ask a multi-part and very deep question. How does preservation policy in the US support or challenge the operational carbon equation, preservation of inefficient windows, wall assemblies, inability to apply PV, and so on, challenges any designated building or other building in a historic district? I.e., is it good to keep a bad building as opposed to replacing it? Operational versus embodied carbon is kind of the heart of that question.
Yeah, of course. There is no denial that there are conflicts. And the National Park Service, I think, is not your good old Oldsmobile anymore. But then, of course, it doesn't always filter down to the local CHAP committees and landmark commissions and what have you in the local jurisdictions that have the ultimate say about your buildings. I have worked with the National, not the National Park Service, the National Trust for Historic Preservation and all these national groups that we did this analysis about which parts of Baltimore perform the best in terms of economic development and preservation of values on buildings, and found that the ones that have the highest level of preservation are the most economically vital. So just to say that the national folks on preservation are more and more not just the ones that say, okay, every detail of the building has to be historic, but that they understand the economic implications, the environmental implications. They are generally saying, yeah, that's the greenest building is the one that you don't have to build. And that is probably true when you do an overall footprint analysis, but then it doesn't help you when you have leaky windows. And that is true, and that is a fight on every single building to see. I had the Marlboro building on Utah Place that is 10 stories high, and it had hundreds of windows in it, if not thousands. And we had a compromise that the first 2 floors had to be wood replicas and the rest could be aluminum when there was the sightlines and so on, if they met the old wood windows. And so we resolved that we could have energy efficient windows at least in 80% of the building. Things like that are possible, but they do require push and pull.
Chris, you've got your hand raised. Do you want to lower your hand and unmute and ask your question?
Sure, thanks. And what, Klaus, one of the things I know certainly that happens in Maryland and probably most other states is that they're hesitant to jump into policy issues unless something is proven in a local jurisdiction. And I know we have certain jurisdictions, say Montgomery County, for instance, that is a little more progressive on moving some issues like that. And that's certainly easier to move on, some issues like, land use and density and things like that. But are you aware of other states that have local jurisdictions that have pushed some of the, issues of, carbon sequestration and things like that, have initiated those on a local level? I'm just wondering if there are things like that that we might look to try to to test the waters here for Maryland, targeting a local jurisdiction and trying to push that to state. I know, that's one of the things that we've also done with or tried to encourage in terms of energy efficiency is the state owned and operated buildings. It's easier to make a target with those because you have a long time owner operator there, and we can usually influence policy a little bit more with the state. But I just wanted to see if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't know of any other jurisdictions that have implemented the policies that I proposed there about no net loss and carbon balance and incentives and so forth. I was long involved heavily as a founding member of the Thousand Friends of Maryland in this sprawl and smart growth discussion that started under Schaefer and had its peak under Glendenning. And just like Glendenning said, okay, the state is not gonna put stuff out in the green fields anymore, so we are putting the branch university in Hagerstown in the middle of town instead of where it was originally planned when he got into office. Those kinds of steps, they are not necessarily precedented elsewhere. So Glendenning did things on smart growth that other states had not yet done. He wasn't just copying what Portland, Oregon had done or so. And this is probably necessary here too, that Maryland sometimes goes out up front. And I find that is a large fertile field is to tie the smart growth principles that are well established since the 1990s in terms of infrastructure savings or land savings, and tie them really to a carbon budgeting mechanism. And that carbon budgeting mechanism is much more acute now after we are so much more aware of the targets that we overslept 40 years. So we need to do everything in the last 10 years now. And so we need to really be creative. And I think that is a large area where we can make progress if we put the regulations together that target carbon in the land use question. So it's using the smart growth vehicles that we have and tighten them up and make them really quantifiable with carbon targets.
Great, thanks.
All right, I don't see any other raised hands. There was a side discussion here on polystyrene, which, Klaus, your chart kind of changed my look on building materials by putting EPS at the very top of the carbon impact. And I think that has to be because of blowing agents, something we've been having a pretty good discussion on industry-wide. Foam blowing agents, what expands the foam. Diana shared a link, excuse me, to XPS made with pentane, which is a global warming potential of 10 instead of some of the refrigerants they use that are more like a global warming potential of 2000 in some cases. Where do we stand, and what are viable alternatives? And this might be a ask the bigger group for continuous insulation is the best insulation, but if it has the highest global warming impact of all of the materials we're selecting, maybe it wasn't the right move.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the answer, but it's obvious that the foam agents are the drivers, and this is similar as with the refrigerants in the HVAC equipment, that you can replace them. So the key here is to be cognizant and use the material palette and use the sources that you get from the material providers, and put something in the specifications so that you may have performance criteria in there instead of just a product, and say there's a limit on embodied carbon. And this is like in many other things, you know, obviously if you use mineral fiber, that's better than foam, but then it takes more space, and it's just not always a useful surface on the top of the roof. It's better underneath the roof. So, you know.
Yeah, and it's not quite rigid enough for for some
Exactly.
assemblies.
Exactly.
It's another no free lunch moment. I am excited that that California, Washington, and a third state I always forget out here on the East Coast, I'll come back up with it, have taken up the federal 2017 legislation that wasn't enforced on refrigerants and blowing agents. So starting in the mid 2020s, you won't be able to buy foam in those states. And of course, as California goes, so goes much of the nation, just because they're such a big market. So you won't be able to buy foams with those blowing agents anymore. Won't be available on the market there. And they're looking hard at building refrigerants as well, which have the same issues. So whole deep dive if you want some homework this weekend for the crowd. With that, I don't see another hand raised, and we are at time. I want to say thank you again, Klaus. Every time I see your presentation, I always pick up something, and today it's on blown foam agents. So that was wonderful. And we will be picking up the coat again starting in January. We're looking at some actual in-person events next late winter or early spring. So stay tuned, and that's going to be fun. In the meantime, there are events in there is a link for the Maryland Climate Change Commission. Be sure to copy that out before we close the session. And thank you for joining us. Oh, this video will be available in probably about a week on the AIA Baltimore YouTube page. So if you care to catch some of these graphics again, it'll be there. Thank you again.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Klaus.
Klaus, thank you again. I'm going to say it again. That was really great. I picked up several things in there that, you know, I've done some thinking on this, and that was still some great stuff. From there, we will send you when the video's up, and you know, it goes on the social media feeds